during that period of maybe where it was too aggressive or people reacted too strongly, did you ever see any overseas hirers sort of walk away from the UK at all because it was just too hard? Welcome to Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Andrew Fahey. And in this podcast, we explore the exciting challenges of taking your business globally. And we do that by inviting some of the best minds from their respective fields to discuss and share their stories of either taking their business globally or helping others do that. And today we're going to focus on the topic of IC vetting or employment status tests. So for businesses who want to gain access to the flexible workforce, what are the risks associated with that? And today, to help us with that discussion, we have Michael Cleverly from CoComply. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Delighted to be here.
Excellent. Right. Well, we'll start straight away, and we'll start with a nice, easy question. Just explain who CoComply are, what are the services that you deliver, and then tell us your story. How did you get to where you are today?
Okay, so I'll start with a bit about me, if that's all right, and then I'll go into CoComply. So I've had 20 years experience in the workforce sector. I started back in 2004 when I left uni in recruitment and had a couple of jobs in that market, and then set up my own business when I was about 26, which focused on contract and permanent recruitment into the online gambling sector.
Oh, wow.
Enough, which is very
niche.
Very niche, very big boom market at the time. And we managed to exit that business to a global PLC recruitment company. So went through an earn out there and got some fantastic experience there and learned a lot about operating in a large environment from a startup. And after that, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I went and did a bit of time in the payment sector. I did a year there, and then got the bug back to start my own business again. So we founded CoComply to deal with the global issue of worker misclassification. We're talking about the UK market a lot today, and IR35, of course, but it is a global problem, and it's had a pretty significant impact on a number of organisations and contractors across the UK, as we know.
Excellent, interesting story. Lots of variation there. And for some of our listeners who potentially overseas or not familiar with this, just explain a little bit more around what IR35 is.
So IR35 is a piece of tax legislation which was originally introduced in 2000 by Gordon Brown. And effectively what it tries to do is to ensure that contractors, when they're providing services to businesses, are working in the context of a business-to-business relationship and not an employee-to-business relationship. And the reason for that is there was a bit of abuse of the system of workers that would, or contractors that would provide services to businesses via an intermediary. So they'd set up their own limited company, provide their services to a business, and as a consequence, they would pay a lot less tax than an employee, and the business would pay less tax. So IR35 was originally introduced to try and prevent that, and it was brought in obviously by it's now HMRC, who felt they were suffering fairly significant losses from the way these guys were or some of these contractors were operating. That ran until 2017. And up until that point, it had been the contractor's responsibility to determine their tax status and submit their tax return and tell HMRC whether they were at which capacity they were working in. HMRC found that very difficult to police at scale. There's 4.3 million self-employed workers in the UK. The main issue, in my view, is probably around there's kind of 2 million of what you consider highly skilled workers. And it was just too much for HMRC to police. So in 2017, in the public sector, they changed legislation to make it the responsibility of the engaging body to determine the tax status of their workers. And in 2021, they've done that in the private sector as well. There's been some fairly significant consequences.
So I guess translating that for a slightly broader audience, you have employees, you have ICs, and IR35 is the UK legislation that puts you in either one of those buckets.
Exactly.
And I guess playing devil's advocate for a moment here, I always find it potentially counterintuitive. So we're in a post-COVID world.
Yeah.
We've got the fluidity of the workforce. We're all working remotely. We're now becoming beyond borders. No excuse for the pun there. Beyond borders more than ever.
Yep.
Yet the UK government is making it harder and less attractive to use this flexible labour. Is that a fair accusation?
It is fair to a point, because the way the legislation is structured and currently policed has historically been fairly poor. There's been quite a number of issues with it, not least with the tool that the government provides, CEST, which is littered with flaws and has resulted in some pretty significant heavy fines for its users.
Famously developed by independent contractors.
Developed by independent contractors. No hypocrisy there whatsoever. But it is they are currently trying to improve the process and offer a lot more guidance for organisations and how they can manage this to ensure compliance more seamlessly. And I think the key message is it is absolutely possible to operate a business process that will manage this. Manage compliance accurately and fairly for contractors without exposing yourself to particularly high risk. It is just companies getting used to how they need to do that.
Okay. And I was clearly playing devil's advocate there. I think you said earlier on in the podcast, most countries and governments around the world now have either processes or pieces of legislation which are there to make sure that employees are classified as employees and genuinely self-employed people are classified as such. And for as much as there is a theme throughout them all, each specific country has their own nuances, which IR35 has. And I guess, and this might be oversimplification here, but I always sort of think of it as the duck test. If you look like an employee and you act like an employee and you get the benefits of being an employee, it's hard to feel hard done to when you are taxed as an employee. And I guess that's that too simplistic a view of...
No, not at all. There was the case of the kind of example that's given that, I don't know, Sarah or John finishes employment on a Friday and turns up Monday as a contractor. And that was part of the rhetoric that HMRC sort of worked to, and that was unfair on the other employees, that they were coming back normally on a higher day rate and yet paying less tax and saving the employer money. So that's true. And globally, yes, it's a big issue for the revenue department. It's a multi-jurisdictional challenge. Self-employment is forecast to overtake employment by 2028. Revenue, the global revenue departments are very conscious that if they don't get correct legislation and compliance requirements in place, they're going to be subject to much less revenue.
But that's the key, isn't it? That getting the balance between empowering the flexible workforce and treating people who genuinely take the risk of being self-employed as self-employed, and capturing those who clearly abuse the systems. Is the challenge here for every government and every jurisdiction when they look at this. And one of the things I find interesting, just looking at this from a UK perspective out, and this might be culturally more to do with being British, the groundswell of people who continually think IR35 will be abolished. And I don't know whether that's hope or misguided sort of just, well, wouldn't it be great? Do you have a view on that? Given every other country in the world has a version of this, why would the UK abolish IR35?
Yeah, I personally can't see it. I think it would come as quite a shock now. I mean, we've had the whole Liz Truss thing, which was quite quickly quashed. And also they're making quite strong amendments to legislation. As I said, HMRC are trying to improve their guidance, and they have made some updates to the CEST tool. not really enough in my opinion. But yeah, I think it's unlikely, and I think they've also introduced the tax offset changes, which come into force in April, and that significantly reduces the risk to organisations as well. So effectively means that the taxes that the contractor has paid will be deducted from any fines.
And I think I think part of the role I can play here is to try and sort of simplify it a little bit for the audience. And I think here's how I think about the recent tax changes, and feel free to, and please do correct me if I get this wrong. When the iterations to IR35 happened, so the public sector and then more lately the private sector, what happened is end hirers were worried about engaging with independent contractors for risks that they got this wrong, and they suffered lots of penalties, and we'll come on to that a bit more. This creates a level of fairness, which basically says if you tried to do it right and you've gone through the reasonable care process, but actually when we've assessed it, we've just got a different view, the taxes that you've paid previously will get knocked off any taxes owed. Is that probably a way of thinking about it?
That's it. I think what they're trying to do, and as you said, sort of taking the technical aspect away from it, is trying to be fair with the legislation now. They've looked at it and said it's overcomplicated, it's too high risk, and actually double taxing two parties is not fair, and it overcomplicates it for businesses. So my view on the changes, and we can come into kind of the potential regulation of the umbrella sector as well, is that they'll continuously try to improve this now and make it a bit more simplistic, a bit easier to understand, a bit more straightforward for organisations to implement, and therefore they'll start to encourage the ecosystem of contractors and entrepreneurs, if you like, being able to start their businesses. It did have a negative impact initially. I think it's 20% of UK's contractors moved abroad or sought engagements with overseas clients. 10% couldn't find work at all because of the impact of IR35 on their clients. So they've recognised that. I think, and they're trying to make improvements.
And do you think that changes if we get a Labour government at all?
Honestly, no. It's generating a fair amount of revenue for HMRC. It was a system that was at times abused. I would be very surprised if it's reversed. I think they may continue to simplify it and bring in other changes. But I can't see a government coming in, and especially in the situation we're in with the economy at the moment, and writing off what they estimate to be 1.4 billion. Tax.
And I agree with that. And on Beyond Borders, we obviously clearly focus on helping UK businesses expand globally, but also overseas businesses coming into the UK and opening up. During that period of maybe where it was too aggressive or people reacted too strongly, did you ever see any overseas hirers sort of walk away from the UK at all because it was just too hard?
No, I haven't seen. We have seen some changes with mergers and acquisitions. So organisations that are maybe looking to buy a UK company, and this just isn't an overseas issue either. It's a large organisation in the UK that's looking to maybe buy a smaller entity. But I guess this is what we've seen. When that larger organisation buys a smaller entity, all of a sudden, because currently smaller organisations are exempt from the legislation. So naturally, they haven't put that much rigor around their processes and their compliance, and the contractor remains responsible. So we've seen big companies from the US and France and an Australian organisation, 3 separate deals trying to buy UK companies, and all of a sudden these small entities are becoming large entities and therefore have to comply with legislation. What impact does that have? Well, lots of small entities use a lot of contractors because they're scaling the business. They don't want to overload themselves with perms. So that we've seen that complication. It depends on if you're coming to the UK, if you're an overseas business, you come to the UK, speak to a specialist, because the legislation is quite nuanced. It is unlikely to impact you on day one, but just take advice, look at the situation, and if you're starting out afresh, it's really not that difficult to get a robust process in place. It's really not. It's much more complicated for a big established organisation in the UK that hasn't got the process in place to then go and implement them at scale. Okay.
And I think that's great advice. But as we know, the world's full of rule breakers.
It is.
So What happens to those people that say, thank you, Michael, great advice, thanks, CoComply, but I'll be okay. I'm just going to ignore that. What's the risk of not complying with IR35?
Well, it's fairly significant in terms of penalties. So the penalties can normally work out about 60% of the engagement value. So you've seen in the public sector, you've seen fines like DWP was 90 million, Innovate UK 36 million, the NHS 4.5 million. So
significant penalties.
Yeah, they're large. If you're spending £1 million on contractors a year, which is, that's normally about 10 sort of skilled workers type. You're looking at 600 grand a year, potential penalties plus interest, plus that compounds, plus your reputation in the market. Mm-hmm. Contractors are really savvy about IR35 now. And even if it's not their responsibility, if they go to be engaged by a company that's ignoring it, a lot of them won't want to get involved because it raises red flags about the general integrity of the business.
It's a real interesting point, that, isn't it? Yeah. I think businesses have to acknowledge that a global, flexible workforce is the future.
Yeah.
And if you take a stance which is detrimental to that workforce, they're going to vote with their feet, and they're going to engage with your competitor who try and do things right. That doesn't mean you don't follow the legislation. It just means you put fair and appropriate processes in place.
Fair, appropriate, robust processes is really. I mean, organisations in the UK that have put all that in place have continued to have great access to talent. We've seen a lot of organisations that have put all their contractors on payroll. They've taken so they're still engaging contractors, which is great, but most contractors don't want to work on payroll for a whole host of reasons, and are willing to take the risks that come with not being employed as well, which is often the counterbalance that's ignored. Of course, yeah. You're running your own business. There's no guarantee of future work. You don't get benefits, etc. You could go on all day about that. What a lot of organisations don't realise that have taken that approach is when you're actually breaking it down, and this is where the kind of complexities come in, because it straddles tax, procurement, HR, and rarely do companies really break down, okay, what's the cost of putting all these contractors on payroll? Depending on if there's an agency on the supply chain, you're looking up to about 75% uplift. It's enormous. It's an enormous increase in costs. Yeah. But it doesn't always get flagged. Yeah. And I think and then there's operating cost as well of running payrolls, HR functions that have to scale with those as well. And the risk, if you're using umbrella companies, it's not risk free. We know that. Companies don't actually have a really transparent view of the cost. And I think if they did, they'd probably, the companies that have had that kind of blanket approach, they'd look at it and go, well, this is ridiculous. Yeah. We need to put something more robust in place. And it always happens. It's the change curve, isn't it? People overreact, then they sort of acknowledge it, and then they get on the bus and move with it. And I think we're on that stage now, aren't we? We definitely are. I can understand a lot of organisations, when the legislation first came in, they took that, a lot of organisations took that risk-averse approach. They kind of wanted to see what happened. Not helped by the Liz Truss which just kind of created this whole are they going to reverse it and they're going to get rid of it? And as we've discussed, they've not. But organisations now are definitely looking at this and going, okay, this is a real thing now. It needs to become part of our day-to-day and our BAU. Let's put something in place. So continuing with that positive spin then, because I think sometimes in the UK people are so blinkered that this is, all countries all around the globe have a variation of this. Little nuances, but in essence, why would our taxation system be any different? So any business looking to come into the UK from abroad and entering that, this shouldn't be such an alien concept to them. There might be regional nuances. So hypothetical, I'm a US business owner looking to set up in the UK. I want to get access to the flexible workforce to keep my fixed costs down. What are the top tips you would give me for understanding how to go about that? Just get your head around the basic principles of the legislation. Understand what it means and what your responsibilities are, and understand how to structure a compliant off payroll engagement. And if you can understand that, you'll start to understand the types of roles that you're looking to hire for, types of engagements you're looking to bring in. Are they likely to be on or off payroll? And whichever the situation is, you can structure them if you've got if you've got a good knowledge of it, expert advice, or you work with a partner, you can structure them to make sure they are compliant with an off-payroll engagement. And if they're not, they're not. You just become aware they need to go on payroll and the associated costs with that. Yeah, it's as simple as that.
Real good advice. Not wanting you to name names, but you can if you want to. As we said, the real breakers. I'm sure you've come across lots of businesses who've just got in a mess with this as well. Any sort of nice stories for the audience, just largely so they know they're not on their own?
Several. I mean, where to start with that? Because the vast majority of companies that we speak to, especially when the legislation first came in, were in a bit of a pickle with it. They were sticking a plaster on it. They didn't have any process in place. They thought they did, and it just wasn't robust enough. One big challenge enterprise organisations have. So there's about 4,000 large private and public sector bodies would kind of fall under the context of what we consider kind of larger enterprise type businesses, and they're the ones with the biggest challenges. Most of them didn't even know how many contractors they had. So you've got the challenge of, okay, we can count the contractors through the HR and talent channel. Is that perfectly segregated? Do we have contractors coming direct to the business via agency? Are there contractors coming through the procurement channel under kind of almost a hidden headcount type situation? Are there consultancies deploying heads and workers into the business under kind of this sort of slightly false statements of work? And organisations often just bury their heads in the sand a bit because they're just like, unpicking this is going to be huge. But once you get started with it, it's fairly straightforward. And most organisations can do that. You work through just categorising the engagements. First, you look at the data. You understand what constitutes a PSC contractor, as HMRC call it. That part is actually not straightforward. It's not just a case of saying, "Oh, that's a one-man band." That's working through an intermediary SaaS contractor, because you can have micro businesses which still constitute in HMRC's eyes a contracting entity and would still come in scope of this. So it's about just getting started. We've seen several companies that have got a fantastic process in place now, and what comes out the other side of it is pretty substantial cost savings that are demonstrable, confidence in your process, access to better talent. All of a sudden, it just becomes part of your BAU.
You understand the mix of your workforce better. There's a percentage that's employed, a percentage that's flexible. You've got the right amount of reporting. As business owners, you look at that and think, why wouldn't I want that?
Why wouldn't I want that? And why wouldn't I be able to, when I'm doing my budget, say, okay, where am I going to stick? Where am I going to allocate my budgets? What's most cost effective? As I said, it's putting people on payroll unnecessarily draws in a substantial uplift in cost, and obviously non-compliance draws in a substantial risk of cost, and reputational damage and everything else that comes with it. And not just reputational damage with your contractors, actually your reputational damage with the revenue. Right. So they start going, well, if you've not got this right, let's you do not want to get into a battle with HMRC. No. So just get a robust process in place and you will see significant benefits.
Great advice. And it's good to know that, organisations aren't on their own. Everybody struggles with it. And as the government and now seem to be becoming more practical with it as well, hopefully that'll help. Pivoting slightly with the questions, where clearly this podcast is called Beyond Borders, and I'm interested to know any interest in CoComply potentially going beyond borders. I might know somebody that can help.
100%. We're looking to expand into the US in 2025.
Excellent.
And in Europe as well. Very shortly after. So we are very much becoming, or have ambitions to become, a global business with our product, which is our technology pilot is live now. So we're asking customers, not just in the UK but globally, to sign up for that and start having a test with the platform. What we're doing, which is our way of helping organisations seamlessly and fairly classify their workers. And as I said, our ambition is to be in the US next year. So
excellent.
We will certainly be having a conversation.
Yeah, look forward to helping you with that one.
Brilliant.
Okay, so we're now going to enter the Quickfire Question, regular feature on the podcast. So just shoot from the hip, first answer whatever comes to mind. So
go for it.
IR35, staying or going?
Staying.
Good. Okay. UK, good for contractors or stay away?
Good and getting better.
best excuse ever given from somebody that wanted to be classified as an IC but clearly wasn't?
They don't get benefits or holiday pay.
That's quite a serious one. I once had somebody who bought some high-vis jackets for the football team, and they were complaining. They were saying they were a legitimate business expense. So there's definitely people who don't do it properly. Give me your elevator pitch why the UK is still a good place to do business.
Wonderful weather.
The magic of podcast, people can't see the rain that's currently hitting the windows while we're doing this.
It was a slightly sarcastic comment there. Wonderful weather. I think the innovation space in the UK is incredible. I think the speed and investment that the government are putting in is really exciting, and I'm aware of a lot of further innovation that's going into the UK. So I think we're going to be leading the way in Europe on a lot of fronts there. So I think it's a fantastic place to do business still. And again, I think it's just going to get better. Yeah.
Okay. Good. And finally, why CoComply?
CoComply is a cost-effective, scalable, and integrated SaaS solution which allows organisations to fairly accurately and seamlessly classify the world's workers. So it's a very innovative business. It's growing very quickly, and we know the space inside and out, and we really understand not just how to classify a worker, but how to build it into your day-to-day operations so it can become part of your BAU and not cause you a headache, but whilst keeping you compliant and cost effective.
Yeah. And I think you've demonstrated that through the answers today. And thank you very much for sharing those experiences and knowledge. And let me try and summarise what I think we've covered today. So IR35, UK tax legislation, designed to the duck test. Are you an employee or are you self-employed? And how we put people into those buckets. It's not just the UK that do this. Most countries around the world have variations of this. So that big sort of this is unfair and it should go away, it's part of a sort of global fluid workforce. The advice that we've covered is it's complicated, but actually if you take time to understand it, if you partner with good people and you put the right processes in, you can work with the legislation. And actually your balance of permanent employees and flexible employees can thrive on the back of that as well. And actually, we both believe the UK is still a good place for contractors and the flexible workforce.
Yep, I've got absolutely nothing to add there. I think you summarise that brilliantly. As I said, I think it's all very manageable if you take the time to get it right, and it can show fantastic ROI to the business once everything's implemented, running seamlessly.
And if people wanted to find out more about CoComply, the services you provide in the UK, or even volunteer to be part of the test bed for the overseas, how do they get in touch?
I would love as many of your listeners to drop me an email or go to the website, cocomply.co.uk.
We'll make sure by magic it's sort of here somewhere for people to do that.
Amazing. Thank you very much. We'd love to give you access to the tech and let you try it out and tell us what you love, tell us what you don't love, and have a call with you and explain what we're trying to do and how we're trying to help.
Michael, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much. And for all our listeners, keep pushing beyond borders. Thank you.